You were recently on Bill Maher's show, and he allowed you to at least review the thesis of Enlightenment now, but then he rattled off a series of things that would seem to counter the idea of progress in humanity today. So I thought, and then what he did was he read off this list and then went to the panel and left Steve standing there. But I have some answers. So I thought I'd read the list, and then here's your chance to respond to Bill Maher. ISIS. Ice caps melting, depleted groundwater, identity theft, Russian meddling, campus rape crisis, opioid addiction, antibiotic-resistant germs, coral reef destruction, colony collapse disorder, bees, violence in football, drought, flooding, brain-eating amoebas. I haven't heard of that one. A billion people still defecate in the street. Police racism. Oceans are lawless and polluted. Solitary confinement, EU is breaking up, refugees, church pedophiles. He came up for air every once in a while on this list and looked at you and then continued. PTSD and veteran suicides, bullying, homophobia, sinkholes, infrastructure crumbling, longer commutes, factory farm runoff, plastic in oceans, endocrine disruptors, running out of water, running out of sand. Your office is killing you. And then he finally got to the only ones that really matter, nukes and climate change. So you wanted to say to him...
Yeah. If at any time you make a list of the worst things that are happening in the world, a world of 7.5 billion people, it's always going to sound dire, because those are the very worst things that are happening. And whether or not progress has occurred, it's irrelevant whether problems exist, because progress doesn't consist of magic, of a miracle, of utopia, of problems disappearing. It means that the problems of yesteryear were worse. And in every one of those cases, it's simply an example of a problem that we're facing now. But for many items in those lists, things were much worse 20 or 30 years ago. It's just that in many cases, people didn't care 20 or 30 years ago. Or that if you just indicate that some ill or harm is greater than zero, you haven't said anything about whether it's gone down, up, or stayed the same. So an example would be bullying. In fact, rates of bullying have come down. When you and I were kids, bullying wasn't considered a social problem. It was considered a part of boyhood. And the idea that the President of the United States would give a speech on the evils of bullying would have been ludicrous. It would have been subject to a satire. But our moral standards have risen, so we, I think, quite rightly believe that bullying is an evil that ought to be eliminated. But because our concern has risen, we mistakenly think that bullying has risen, whereas data on bullying show that it's gone down. Likewise for police shootings. I mean, we should absolutely reduce police shootings in the United States. But police shootings in the 60s and 70s were much worse. But no one makes the comparison. It's one of the pathologies of conventional journalism, that because it focuses on events rather than trends, because it is generally resistant or indifferent to numbers, to data, and because there is both a commercial and a moral impetus to report the worst, both because there's a belief, untested and probably false, that only bad news sells, and because many journalists feel that it's their conscientious responsibility to report what's going wrong. Reporting what's going right is considered to be kind of public relations, advertising for some other section of the paper.
Right.
And so there are habits like compiling these lists, which you can compile at any time. You compile the lists in the 1970s, you would have had double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment and a world that was going to run out of petroleum. Turns out that's not our problem. Our problem is the opposite. There's all too much petroleum. Gas lines, nuclear standoffs between the US and the USSR, including Richard Nixon raising the level of nuclear alert during the 1973 Arab-Egyptian War. Even the concept of war between Israel and Egypt. People seldom notice that that's gone. They don't fight wars anymore. And they used to fight them every few years. And there was an ozone hole. In the 1960s, there was radioactive strontium in milk that was taken up in children's bones and teeth. So compiling a list is really irrelevant to understanding the state of the world. To understand the state of the world, you have to look at data that look at how the various crises have changed over time.
Trend lines, not headlines.
Headlines, as Bill Clinton said. To give
That's right, it was
to.
Clinton that said that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm reminded of the news coverage just the last 2 days of the Hurricane Florence. Yesterday, or maybe it was even this morning, Anderson Cooper is standing, waist deep in water in waders with his microphone, and then just like 3 feet away, the camera crew's in like ankle deep water. And it's like, why is he standing there? Because it's more dramatic.
Yeah.
And then 2 days ago, there was one of these viral videos that went viral of a, I'm not sure what network it was, but a woman or the reporter, I think it was a woman, was leaning into the wind and, screaming into the mic, and and she's got the outfit on, the rain outfit and all that stuff, like she can just barely report the news. And then in the background, you see these 2 guys sort of strolling by with their briefcases, and just like, it was just like another day. It's like, okay.
Well, it is part of a problem, and although I don't want to join in the sometimes paranoid criticism of the mainstream media, because they're much better than the alternative, the non-mainstream media. But on the other hand, there are some distortions that are built into the nature of journalism, and in my books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, and in your book, The Moral Arc, part of my mission, and obviously yours as well, was to point out that the direction of history, even of current affairs, is very hard to glean from the news because of certain systematic distortions. One of them is news is about stuff that happens, not stuff that doesn't happen. And so if there is a part of the world that's been at peace for 30 years, like Southeast Asia, which beforehand was in bloody, horrendous war, then they just decided to stop fighting wars. But not fighting a war is not news because nothing's happening. Gradual changes are not reported. As Max Roser has pointed out, the papers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline because there wasn't a Thursday in October in which it happened.
Right.
And so 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. In fact, people think, when asked point blank, do you think that extreme poverty worldwide has increased, decreased, or stayed the same? A large majority of people say stayed the same or increased, and the answer is decreased. Also, there are some, on top of that, there are a few, I consider it like journalistic malpractice to do this. One of them is to assemble the list of all the things that are going wrong and juxtapose them to imply that we've never faced greater peril. Another one is often there will be a trend, and no trend is perfectly monotonic. That is, always goes down, never, or stays the same, never goes up. All curves for anything you want to measure in a society, in the world, have zigs and zags. So if you take a trend like declining deaths in auto accidents, for example, deaths in auto accidents have gone down by 95% in the last century, but not in 100% of years. The curve looks like this. Okay? Now, imagine that every time the curve reverses direction, there's a story in the paper. Auto accident rate increased this year because it's news, because each of the last 10 years it decreased. So a reader of the paper is going to see nothing but stories about how the rate of auto accidents has increased, whereas in fact the overall trend is for it to decrease. So that's another example of how there's kind of a systematically inaccurate picture of the world from the tiny moving window of daily news reporting. And I can't help but can't resist mention one other kind of systematic pathology, and this is since nothing affects every last person on the planet or every last person in a country, you can always focus on the tails of the distribution to accentuate the negative. So the New York Times, for example, recently had an article after a bit of publicity about the World Happiness Report, which ranks countries in terms of how happy their citizens say they are. And at the top of the list, reliably, are Nordic countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, Finland. And there's an article about how, I'm not making this up, not everyone in Sweden is happy. that if you look at the 10% least happy people in Sweden, they're really not very happy. Now, this should not be news.
Right.
But I think there is something of the ethic that if you're reporting something that's gone well, you're complicit with power.
Yeah. Yeah, as a consumer of news myself, I have to say that, for example, I watch the NBC Nightly News, and the last 5 minutes is always dedicated to some little heartwarming story.
That's even worse. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the family that makes chocolate chip cookies and they're making money, and it's. I have to say, it's boring. I just skip it. It's like
that's exactly right. So the movement toward good news stories has the opposite effect. Because first of all, since these are usually fairly trivial in terms of the big picture, like a lady celebrating her 100th birthday, or a Good Samaritan, or the soccer players rescued from the flooded cave. People know that this is just not representative of the major events in the world. And they rightly compartmentalize it as, they're trying to cheer us up.
Right.
As opposed to stories like global poverty is plummeting, huge parts of the world are at peace that used to be at war. There are successful democracies that no one has heard of, like Somaliland. But they because they don't get reported, and they would be positive news as opposed to the Good Samaritan story.
Yeah. Well, I made a list for Bill Maher, in case he ends up watching this, of things he would have listed several centuries ago that are bad news, that we don't have to worry about anymore. Plagues and diseases like smallpox, measles, leprosy, dysentery, tuberculosis, influenza, infant mortality, childbirth deaths. Not to mention dentistry and medicine. Can you imagine dentistry 5 centuries ago? It was more dangerous to go to the doctor than not, which is, by the way, why homeopathy got a toehold on the imagination, because homeopathy does nothing. And doing nothing was actually better than going to the doctor back when homeopathy was first launched. So it looked like it worked. Famines, no supermarkets carrying plentiful supplies of fresh fruit and vegetables, milk, butter, eggs, and a million other products at a cheap price. No hygiene, no flush toilets, so you don't need toilet paper, obviously. No fresh tap water, no refrigeration, no microwaves, television, central heating and air conditioning in homes, no internet access to all human knowledge available for free, no cheaply mass-produced books. Not that it mattered, because almost everybody was illiterate. And by the way, on the plus side, they had no anti-vaxxers back then. No anti-GMO people, no anti-nuke people. And forget the pedophile priests. The church's inquisition might have burned you at the stake as a witch. And of course, as you document in The Better Angels of Our Nature, the rates of war, homicide, and violence, you and I would have been dead decades ago, probably in our 20s.
Disemboweled, probably.
Disemboweled, or whatever.
But the point of this, and we are in agreement, but it's not. I think we'd both agree. The idea isn't that things get better by themselves, that we don't have to worry about the very serious threats, for example, of climate change, but rather that problems can be solved. They have been in the past, and that this is all the more reason to engage with the various serious threats, including many on Bill Maher's list. It's not to blow off the list or the dangers. Quite the contrary. I think that there can be kind of backfiring of if people are convinced that things are going to get worse no matter what we do, that our problems are hopeless and intractable. If climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence will. I mean, a rational response might be, well, let's enjoy ourselves while we can. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Right.
And there are some data behind it that of people who believe that civilization will collapse within a century. Not surprisingly, they are more likely to endorse the statement, the most important thing is to look after yourself and your family.
Right.
That there's no point in worrying about social problems.
The feeling is, what can I possibly do as an individual?
What can anyone possibly do?
Nothing. Yeah, right, exactly. There is a sense kind of maybe built into our cognition that we tend to think teleologically. So the moment somebody says there's progress, well, you're implying that this is inevitable, like there's this march of progress. And a lot of historical theories were kind of teleological, like Marxism, for example. So when someone like Francis Fukuyama publishes that book in 1980, well, first the essay and then the book later, The End of History, it's like, oh, come on. And he kind of had to walk that back so it didn't sound so teleological. Now I see he's brought it back again with like a follow-up book. And there is that kind of tension, like, are you saying that this is sort of inevitable to a certain extent? And I'm not sure how to get around that other than to say we should just solve problems. But maybe there's a kind of a telos to it in a sense that we're getting better at solving problems. And that the development of reason and science, as you point out, we're not going to go back to slavery. We've gotten past that. We're not going to take rights away from people, the right to vote and so forth. That's not going to happen. I mean, there's a certain kind of inevitability that once you get to a certain place, you're not likely to go far back.
Yeah, because I often face the argument that even if things seem to be getting better, if bad things are going down and good things are going up, well, history is cyclical, so it's only a matter of time before you'll get the next arc in the oscillation, which is an incorrect view of history. I don't think there's anything in history that's ever been cyclical. There is some stochasticity, if I can use a fancy schmancy word, that is randomness. There can be lurches, there can be crises, and there's no guarantee that there still won't be. It's possible that there'll be a catastrophic nuclear war, and all the more reason that we should take steps to prevent it, but no one can say that it can't happen. But it is not true that any time there is an improvement, just wait and it will inevitably be canceled. And as you point out, and both of us point out in our books, some things, when they're abolished, they kind of stay abolished. So
right.
I don't think there's going to be a comeback for having a nice outing on a Sunday afternoon and bringing the whole family to an insane asylum to laugh at the insane.
Right.
Probably not. I don't think we're going to see a comeback for harems and eunuchs. We're probably not going to see a comeback for human sacrifice and for legal slavery. And there's still human trafficking, but it used to be that there was human trafficking and legal slavery.
Right.
And countries, except for Napoleon, who reintroduced slavery after it had been abolished. But generally, when countries abolish slavery, they don't bring it back. Now, so what does this tell us about the possibility of progress? Well, it may be that some things that have happened, such as the decriminalization of homosexuality. There have been countries in Africa that have recriminalized it, but still there are far more decriminalizations than recriminalizations. India just last week decriminalized homosexuality. And we may have surprises, and it's not crazy to think that, for example, war between countries, this is to distinguish them from civil wars, but where the world has 192 countries, and the classic war that we think about in history, when country A declares war on country B and their uniformed armies meet on the battlefield, that is in obsolescence. Statistically, there are fewer and fewer of them. There's still civil wars, militia, guerrilla force against a government. But government A against government B, that's been in decline. It's not inconceivable that that could go the way of slave auctions and human sacrifice.
Yeah. Let's see how far we can go with this idea, that there may be some directionality in the sense that we have a human nature, and by nature we would prefer to be alive than dead, healthy than sick, free than enslaved, and so on. And if enough of us have the power to stand up against those who are trying to oppress us, and you hit this tipping point and we get some momentum, then in a way it can't go back as long as the masses have enough power. So therefore there's something, this is kind of getting at the science and morality, to what extent can science determine morals? Well, to a certain extent, if we want to be free and we prefer to be healthy and so on, won't we all struggle toward that end and away from this bad end and toward the good end? And that could drive history in a certain direction.
Yeah, in the same way that there's no mystical force that makes our computers faster and faster and our hard drives bigger and bigger. It's just that that's what people prefer, and if they can afford to do it at lower cost, the knowledge doesn't go away, so it builds on itself, it's cumulative. And there may be just that the results of human effort and ingenuity can accumulate We don't unknow things that we know. Now, knowledge can get lost. It happened with the fall of the Roman Empire and the onset of the, as they call it, the Dark Ages. But in general, once something is known, it tends to remain known, so knowledge increases unidirectionally. And the realization that, as you put it, it's better to be healthy than sick, alive than dead. Once that starts to spread, it's hard to go back. Now, it's not impossible. With some of the rise of authoritarian nationalist populism, the idea that the glory of the nation trumps the well-being of individual people, so to speak.
Right.
Bad ideas can push back against good ideas,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
Putin's idea that it's worth it to fight a war in Syria to retain the Russian sphere of influence, even if several 100,000 people get killed, that's definitely pushing against this humanistic idea that that has been responsible for a lot of the moral progress of the last 70 years.
But a century ago, there were dozens of Putin-like leaders. Now there's just one or two, maybe two.
And in terms of trying to make sense of what seems to be too uncanny to be believed, namely that at least some things really do seem to be getting better. Again, this is not seeing the glasses half full. This is not wearing rose-colored glasses. This is not being a Pollyanna. This is just looking at the data. I mean, just looking at curves that show improvement.
Can we say something like slavery is really wrong, objectively wrong, morally, I mean, objectively wrong in some. So here I'm getting at this, the theist challenge we always get. Without God, how can you say something is really wrong or objectively wrong or absolutely wrong? And so I like to try to make the argument, well, but it's in our human nature to not want to be enslaved. It's not just an opinion. It's not just a cultural learning thing. So I did this debate a couple of weeks ago with this theist, and so he put this slide up with Mother Teresa and Hitler and said, can you really say Hitler is worse than Mother Teresa? And I thought, boy, if Christopher Hitchens was here, he'd say, no, actually, you can't say he's worse.
Well, that's because he had a big problem with Mother Teresa.
Yes. He wrote that book called A Missionary Position.
Yes.
Oh, boy.
Well, this is a whole other. This is just the example of Mother. It turns out, if you actually ask the question, how much good did Mother Teresa really do, aside from being a symbol of goodness?
Yeah.
It's not so easy to identify. And Hitchens did point out in this rather naughty book that she did a lot of harm as well. But putting that aside, he chose a bad example.
Yes.
So let's say Hitler and Norman Borlaug.
Yeah, Norman Borlaug or anybody. Well, then he said something about, sexual molestation of children is not really wrong if there's no God. So when it was my turn, I said, all right, so this was in a church. So there was 700 people there, and there was 698 born-agains and me and my friend. And a fellow skeptic that was from there. Anyway, so I said, all right, just humor me for 5 minutes and pretend you're all atheists. You don't believe there's a God. Can you think of any reasons why sexually molesting a child would be bad, would be wrong? And you could just see okay, I know this one. I think I know this one. And I kind of had to tease it out of him. And to me, this is one of the harms of religion, that, it just kind of gives you this pat answer that you just say, well, because God says so. How do you know?
Yeah.
Well, it's there in the Bible. No, it's actually not there in the Bible, and there's a lot of worse stuff. And when I push them, it just comes down to that still small voice within. I just kind of know what's right and wrong. It's like, yeah, that's where I get it too, except where does that come from? Genes and culture and so on, and pretty soon we're on the same page, but it takes a long time to get there. For them, the easy answer is, well, it's just wrong because it's wrong. So what I'm trying to do is just make an argument, at least from starting with human nature and scaling up, that we can say certain things really are wrong, like slavery or something like that.
Yes, and I think we're dealing with two questions here. One of them is, how can you make the argument for what philosophers sometimes call moral realism? The idea that moral statements are not just matters of taste or culture or preference, but that objectively it really is bad to murder, to rape, to molest, and so on. And then there's the more kind of historical, practical question of why does it seem, even with the setbacks, that overall humanity seems to be accepting more and more positions that we would deem moral, such as that slavery is wrong, that war is wrong, that persecuting gay people is wrong, and so on. So the first question is the harder one. It is a deep philosophical question.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think what it boils down to is there can be nothing special about me just because I'm me and you're not. That is, I mean, one obvious way to answer the question of why is molesting children wrong is, well, if you were a child, would it be okay if someone molested you? And if not, why is it okay for someone to molest some other child? You can't just say, well, I'm me and that child is someone else, and at least hope anyone else to take you seriously as soon as you engage in any discourse about anything. If you're having the conversation to begin with, if you're reasoning, if you're exchanging arguments, then you've kind of surrendered the right to say, well, I'm just going to predominate what's good for me is good for me, and I'm blowing off everyone else. Well, then why are you even talking to anyone? So there is, and the idea that morality is based on impartiality, on the fact that anything that you agree to that doesn't make you special just because you're you, which is kind of incoherent. I mean, why should I accept that you're special because you're you? Then you get things like the golden rule and the categorical imperative and John Rawls's veil of ignorance, namely the just society is one that you would agree to be incarnated in if you had no idea what your status was going to be. You didn't know whether you were going to be rich or poor or black or white or a man or a woman. Any rules for that society that you agree to a priori, not knowing who you'd be, are ones that you could defend. All of these are different ways of getting around that kind of logical point that there's no magic in the pronoun I that you can get away with. Then the question is, why would anyone buy that? Why is it really? Is there really a trend where we are outraged over children being molested and slaves and human trafficking and bullying and sexually harassing women in the workplace and the university? They were kind of okay a few decades ago. And one of the reasons is that I think at least, that as your universe of discourse, of conversation expands, as more and more people get to take part in the conversation, then any parochial argument or parochial concern, well, I care about me and my kind and my family, it becomes less and less tenable as more and more people join the conversation. So if, and as the forces of cosmopolitanism, globalization mean that we deal more and more with people who aren't like us, we're less able to fall back on parochial arguments that only apply to us. So the couple of examples that I give in Enlightenment now are when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was formulated and agreed upon by a majority of the world's countries in 1948. I think it's aged pretty well. There are all of its rights are ones that we would recognize today. The challenge was, how are you going to get countries across the world to agree on a single set of principles of what human rights are? You might have thought at the time, impossible. The world has so many different cultures, so many different value systems. This is a dream. But if you think, well, what could everyone agree upon? There's certain things that they would not, obviously would be non-starters. Like the first principle for international cooperation is the United States is a shining city upon a hill. Well, probably not a lot of other countries are going to go along with it. Or the main moral principle is that we have to accept Jesus Christ as our Savior. Well, some people would sign on to that, but it would be hard to get, India on board, and China and Israel and so on. So as you peel away all of these parochial bases for a world order, for cooperation, you might worry, well, then what you're going to be left with is zero. Kind of the lowest common denominator is not going to have anything. But in fact, there were, I don't know how many items there were in the Universal Declaration, I think on the order of 40. Excuse me, because, as you say, there actually are a lot of things we can agree on, like it's good for kids to go to school, and it's good for people to be healthy as opposed to sick, and it's good for people to be able to vote in elections in their country and to get a fair trial. And a lot of these things, because of our common humanity, we all want to thrive, we want our kids to thrive. The lowest common denominator is actually pretty high for humanity as a whole.
I forget who you quoted in there about saying, we defend these rights as long as you don't ask us to explain
Yes.
why we think they're right.
John Humphrey, a great Canadian, who, when challenged, again, one of the problems, if you try to even time travel back, put yourself in the shoes of intellectuals, moralists, political leaders in the late 40s. World War II had just happened, 55 million people killed, a Holocaust. How are you going to lay out a set of principles for the whole world to prevent this from happening again? And if you try to start from some philosophical first principle, some foundational text, obviously it's not going to fly.
Right.
And so they deliberately aimed at something that, at least by their standards, was kind of shallow and thin, like no philosophy. Right. Of course, there really was a philosophy. But by not starting with some principle that people could start arguing about from the get-go, and instead saying things like killing people is bad, which everyone agrees to,
right.
They actually made a huge amount of progress. Eleanor Roosevelt deserves credit for it,
yeah.
John Humphrey, and there were a number of others who pushed it along with a fairly shallow philosophy by design.
Yeah, maybe that's the right approach. I've tried to defend the idea of natural rights based on human nature along the lines of what I just did. But my critics just, they return to Bentham, rights are nonsense and natural rights are nonsense on stilts. You can't defend it philosophically. And my professional philosopher friends tell me, yeah, that's right, Shermer, you can't defend it philosophically. There's not really a foundation there. Maybe it's just better to say, you know what, can we agree it's wrong to kill people? Yeah. Don't call it a right.
Yeah. Well, and Bentham, of course, as a utilitarian, replaced rights with interests, namely,
oh, right.
The morality consists of the greatest good for the greatest number. Where, of course, then you say, well, what do you mean by good? And again, it's not that controversial that you'd rather be healthy than sick, dead than alive, well-fed rather
right.
than hungry, and so on. And of course, Bentham, even though we could kind of sneer at Bentham as having a kind of shallow, nerdy, quantitative morality, greatest good for the greatest number. But Bentham also was an early, maybe the first champion of what we would today call gay rights. He would never call it gay rights, but he basically said since homosexual activity makes some people happy and it makes no one unhappy, there can be no moral argument against it.
Right.
He was an early champion of, again, he would never call it animal rights. That may be just a kind of shorthand. But he was the one who had the famous quotation, the question is not whether they can think or whether they can speak, but whether they can suffer. So he had, even by retreating from the lofty language of rights to the more pedestrian language of interests, what's good, what's bad, what causes pain, what causes pleasure, you can make a lot of headway in terms of a moral system that you can defend.
Yep. So I've recently been kind of rethinking some of my thoughts on government aid to the poor and social spending. I'd say you changed my mind in your section in Enlightenment now on social spending. You have that great graph showing about 20% of GDP is allocated to social spending.
22% to median among OECD countries, yeah.
And all these, pretty much all the Western democracies. And we're actually above Canada, which I couldn't believe.
So this is a bit of a paradox. So every country, if you look at the amount of GDP that is allocated to the sick, to children, to the poor, to the aged, before the 1920s, it's about 1%, and then in all countries, it shoots up. Now, here's a paradox. I raised this with my brother, Rob Pinker, who works for the government in Ottawa as a policy analyst. And he invited me to speak there, and I laid this paradox to his fellow analysts. I said, Canada is 19%. Now, why Canada has a reputation of having a very robust social safety net. And actually, I haven't been able to get a straight answer, because Canada does have a robust social safety net, but it's actually, in percentage of GDP terms, it's smaller than the United States. Anyway, that's just a side comment. They're all in a fairly narrow band, all the developed countries. And as Michael Lind put it, the kind of libertarian paradise of wealthy countries with no social safety net, no substantial redistribution does not exist. Now, this doesn't mean, that by itself is not an argument that it can't exist, but it is a fact that we have to take seriously, that no developed country has proceeded along those lines of letting the poor fend for themselves.
It made me think of those historical trends that may have some, not inevitability, but some directionality to it. Based on our nature, we don't want to be poor, and your principle of interchangeable perspectives. Therefore, I don't want to see somebody poor, because that could be me there, but for the grace of the flying spaghetti monster, go I, or whatever. And so, so maybe an argument could be made that something like a fifth of your GDP should be allocated, because we have a moral obligation to help people that need help. Now, these are people who've had the bad luck of being born in single homes, or in poverty, or in gangs, or bad neighborhoods, mental illness, drug addictions, the kinds of things you really have little control over, and you didn't choose to be that way. Don't we have a moral obligation to help them? Now, since I'm an atheist, and you're an atheist, and we would like to see the influence of religion continue to decline for a lot of other reasons, I have to say, that churches manning the soup kitchens and helping the poor, I have to give them that. That's a good thing that they've done historically. If they continue to wane, then the only choice would be government to do it.
Well, yes, and in the era in which social services were provided by the church, it was about 1.5% of GDP. In the era in which government picked up the slack, more than picked up the slack, it was 22% of GDP. So the amount, even though soup kitchens are great, but in terms of the number of people lifted out of poverty, it's
so they really didn't do. It was more like Mother Teresa of just offering them, it's going to be great in the next life.
Right. And what they did, the soup kitchens did give soup to poor people, but just government is just by reason of scale is just far better equipped to do it. To say nothing of universal education, of social insurance for the elderly. And so I think one of the reasons is this expanding moral circle of treating more people as worthy of concern and sympathy, presumably because you can imagine yourself in their shoes. So there is that kind of compassion argument. The other reasons for this massive expansion of social spending in the 20th century were that some of them are public goods, like education, that we're all better off if kids get educated. So we're not just benefiting kids, we're benefiting everyone in the future. A third would be a kind of insurance, that even though people aren't willing to take out an insurance policy against being unemployed or sick for themselves, they kind of depend on the government to do that for them. They really do think that could be me.
But there's a lot of conservative, so let's steel man the conservative position for a moment. The secular conservative, just arguments against it because of corruption in the system and abuse. And someone like Heather McDonald, who I just had on my Science Salon podcast that I'll post next week, she calls herself a secular Republican. She's an atheist. Okay.
She founded a website for secular conservatives. It had 2 people on it.
That's right.
One of whom then flamed out because of a humorous column he wrote that was interpreted as racist.
Oh, no.
This is John Derbyshire, yes.
Oh, right.
So
right.
50% of the secular conservatives had to kind of go underground.
Small in number. We need them, bring them over to our side. But so her argument against this, I read her that section from your book and said, don't we have a moral obligation to help people? So her argument was a little contra to, say, Jonathan Haidt's argument in The Coddling of the American Mind, that the problem we face is, helicopter parenting, and we've sort of over-safetyized children and so on. Her argument is that it's a deeper problem having to do with loss of conservative values like marriage and family and law and order and policing and strong military. And, she sort of went down the bullet list of conservatives positions that make, I kind of roll my eyes when I hear a lot of this. But then she kind of deconstructed it, like the 3 things you could do to stay out of poverty is graduate from high school, get a job, and don't have children until you get married. And statistically speaking, that'll lift you high probability out of poverty. Okay, so it's like, okay, yeah, I can see that. How do you counter conservative arguments that this is better done through free markets and private enterprise and keep the government out of my Medicare?
Right. Yeah. No, I think these are arguments that have to be taken seriously. There are arguments against just having a unlimited social spending. It could bankrupt governments. It could empower bureaucrats as opposed to helping the beneficiaries. It could create perverse incentives against work for irresponsible teenage pregnancy and so on. And these are arguments that also go back to people like to Charles Murray before he became notorious for his work on IQ, to even to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who pointed to some of the hazards of the structure of the African-American family back in the 1960s, for which he was lambasted, but I think nowadays most social scientists would say that he actually had his finger on something.
Yeah.
So I think that it is part of the answer is it's inherent to any kind of insurance that people, that you could, there is the, as they call it, the moral hazard, that people might take foolish risks knowing that they're going to be bailed out if a catastrophe happens. But that argument has to be balanced against the harm that not helping people in need have. It's probably true that if we abolished the fire department, then people would be more careful about putting out cigarettes and checking their wiring and putting up smoke detectors. But still, on average, it really is better to have a fire department.
Right.
There's an argument that if you really wanted people to drive more safely, you should install a big spike on the steering wheel pointing to the driver's heart, and people would drive really, really carefully.
Right.
So on the one hand, I mean, so it's not an argument to blow off, but it's just a question of balance. You really want a social welfare system that really helps the people who need help, who deserve help, without creating the perverse incentives to rely on too much on welfare. So she has a point.
Yeah.
And of course, there's also the point that there's massive waste in the social transfer systems in many countries. I mean, varies from country to country. One of the answers to why Canada spends a smaller percentage of its GDP is it may be more efficient, there may be less waste.
Right.
And there is an argument, one of the arguments, among the arguments that we've recently heard for a universal basic income, every citizen getting a check from the government, is that would replace the massive bureaucratic infrastructure, the huge patchwork of, well, in the United States at least, of food stamps and temporary assistance for needy families and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Just fire all the bureaucrats, rent out all the buildings, and just give people money directly. People know how to spend it for their own benefit. Probably not quite, but the question of whether there are more effective ways to transfer money to help people in need than the current government bureaucracy is a legitimate question.
But then the counter argument, so you give everybody $1,000 a month, and then a certain percentage goes straight to the liquor store or the marijuana, medical marijuana, whatever, and it's gone. Then what? Then they're homeless on the streets, and then what?
Yeah.
And then you reintroduce government programs to help them.
No, indeed, yeah.
Another thing I've been conflicted about, I'd like to get your thoughts on affirmative action, Head Start programs, that sort of thing. President Johnson famously said in 1964, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him. Bring him to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough to just open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates." I'd say in 64 that's got to have been true, and maybe it's at least partially still true today. But I'm not sure. There's a lot of African-American conservatives, Thomas Sowell or Larry Elder, the radio talk show guy, says, that's enough. We've caught up now. There's others that say, nope, there's institutional racism still present, and then they give examples of this that are real. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you've stated the issues well. It's been 50 years since LBJ's Great Society. Has that been enough? I don't know if we know the answer. I think what we do know is that if you were to eliminate all compensatory programs, all affirmative action, there would be an imbalance in American universities and corporations. The percentage of minorities would go down, and no institution can let that happen. I mean, this is an argument from Nathan Glazer, the great sociologist, a colleague of mine at Harvard. He said, we don't have to know the answer, we don't know the answer, but it's just not going to be acceptable for any institution to have a very tiny proportion of racial minorities. Even whether or not it's racist, it's going to look racist. That's not going to be good for society, for members of those minorities to think that there's no way to get ahead, and having that diversity is a social good, even if we don't understand the causes.
Right. Well, your own university is being sued by Asian students, right, for discriminating against them. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out, which brings me to identity politics. To me, this feels like the opposite direction of Martin Luther King's dream of judging people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And now that has expanded to your gender, your sexual orientation, your class, your religion, your language, and so on. Everybody has a half a dozen to a dozen categories they could be put in. It seems like pigeonholing people into these boxes is the opposite direction. And yet I could see the argument, as it began, at least as a reasonable a way to think about social problems, that there might be these kind of biases built into our systems.
Yeah, I think there's, to the extent that there are common interests of all women, or all gay people, or all African Americans or Afro-Canadians, then it makes sense to have some kind of common platform, common agenda, common demands. But of course, those are not the only things that define our interests. We all have an interest in being healthy and not sick, in not being discriminated against for any reason. And ultimately, it's only the fact that someone who's discriminated against suffers harm as an individual that makes discrimination harmful. And that these group interests, these various unions, coalitions, are strategic ways of preventing harm against individuals, at least so I would argue, but that ultimately a group doesn't feel pain, a group doesn't prosper, it's individuals who have various things in common. And there is a very different view of moral progress that comes from, that's embodied in identity politics, which is that progress consists of struggle in zero-sum competition between groups. It's kind of an idea that was perhaps adapted from the Marxist idea of class struggle, that improvement comes when the proletariat vanquishes the bourgeoisie, that there's no way that all members of the proletariat can be given a fair shot on the same terms as the bourgeoisie. There's just teams, they're always competing. If one does better, the other one does worse, and what we've got to make sure is that those who used to be on top are no longer on top. And that's often the way social progress is framed in terms of men, women, black, white, gay, straight, in this social justice warfare, identity politics way of looking at things. And of course, not to deny that there has been harassment of women and discrimination against women and discrimination against various minorities. But the idea that the way to rectify it is to change the balance so that regardless of criteria of merit or fairness, we give more power to the people who used to have less power and take away power from those in power.
Right.
That's what I think the fallacy is.
I think was it Paul Bloom's study, or part of his team, showing that it isn't income inequality that bothers people, it's how the inequalities came about. If it was because of an unfair, unjust system where it's rigged for certain people, that's what they don't like, not if you fairly made more money than somebody else.
Yeah, so this is a review of the literature by Christina Starmans and Paul Bloom, and a third author whose name escapes me now. And this is speaking to a widespread belief in social science that people have an aversion to inequity, to economic inequality, that people would rather give up resources and would be very happy to take away resources from those who have more in order that everyone be the same. And they looked at the literature and they found that actually is not true. That's actually not the way people think. They are, people are okay with economic inequality if they perceive that it's due either to an impartial lottery, that everyone had a fair chance, some may have won, some may have lost, or if they think that it's fairly rewarded based on effort or talent or sacrifice, and that the idea that people want everyone to have the same amount is just empirically false. The studies when you look at them, don't show that.
Right.
And of course, it doesn't mean that today the concern about inequality is necessarily unjustified. But it probably means that what people are really offended by is not the existence of inequality, but the feeling that the system is rigged against them,
Yeah.
which is not the same thing.
Yep. I'm reminded of one of my best friends made many millions, tens of millions of dollars selling chocolate chip cookies. And everybody likes that. It's like
It's not a Girl Scout.
no, he's just making cookies. And it feels different than
Yeah.
the Wall Street trader just moving binary digits around on a screen, making tens of millions of dollars. It's like there's some intuitive, sort of an evolutionary economics sense of, what feels like it's okay to be successful at, or other things that it's sort of that dark thing that's going on over there, and they're doing mysterious things on that screen, and they're making more money than me. It feels like there could be rigged, and we know these systems. I mean, there's a reason there's insider trading laws, and they're broken constantly because that kind of stuff does go on,
Yeah.
which is unfair.
Yeah, well, I think there are two things going on there in terms of our intuitive economics, what we think of as fair and unfair. And there certainly is a perception that there are people who are gaming the system and getting ill-gotten gains. But in addition to that, there's also an intuition that people who cause physical stuff to come into existence are adding to welfare, and people who are just manipulating symbols and information are
Right.
not. That farmers are legitimate and praiseworthy, and silversmiths and miners, but not retailers or people who charge interest. And Thomas Sowell has pointed out that that economically this is nonsense, that by making the flow of goods and services more efficient, one can add enormous value. And indeed, the path to wealth is not just working harder and growing more corn, but figuring out how to get it to people who want corn before it rots, and figuring out ideas that make more corn grow out of a given plot of land, and people who lend the farmer money to buy the seed corn that results in corn later. And that because probably he doesn't appeal to evolution, I would appeal to evolution, that because institutions of modern markets are so recent in human history, they aren't
Right.
intuitive.
Right.
And you see as a recurring pattern through history that moneylenders are reviled, Jews being the most obvious example, and middlemen, merchants,
Right.
retailers are reviled, Jews and Asians and other middlemen minorities, Caribbean immigrants to the United States, Indians in Africa, overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. And what's something called he calls it the physical fallacy, the idea that wealth consists of stuff, has
Right.
often been a trigger of accusations of cheating and greed and perfidy and dishonesty against middlemen. Now, this isn't to say that all middlemen are honest, and there certainly has been chicanery on Wall Street.
Right.
But I think there are these two phenomena that go into that intuition.
The other thing I've noticed that also seems intuitively unfair, and I don't know what to do about it, and maybe it's actually okay. So this is something like the stock market, or how money just grows itself, compound interest being the most famous example. But let's say I have 100 shares of Apple stock, you have 1,000 shares of Apple stock, and the two other people, the invisible people on the stage, have 10,000 shares and 100,000 shares. I mean, there are people that have 100,000 shares of Apple stock. So when it goes up $10 in one day, let's say, I've just made $1,000, but I didn't do anything to earn that. But I'm okay with that. But wait a minute, you just made an order of magnitude more money than I did. So you got richer even faster than I got richer, and so on. That just seems built into the system. And I can see why the guy down there that has 1 share, or the one over there has 0 shares, and he can't even afford a single share, would say, this is rigged. How do I even get into the system?
Yeah, no, and there is a problem of, well, first of all, differentiating what we might defend as a legitimate way for the entire society to get richer, namely that there's some liquidity of capital and an incentive to invest, because clearly we wouldn't have our iPhones and our iMacs unless someone invested money in Apple earlier that they used to design the devices, build the factories before they could
Right.
earn a profit. So, I mean, that's a part of that system that we can defend, as opposed to some of the manipulations and the derivatives that just add instability to the system, the way the system seems to be set up so that risks are, foolish risks are taken because the government will underwrite them. As they say, profits are privatized, but risks are socialized.
Yep,
So there are
yep.
elements of the system that are probably unfairly attacked by the critics of capitalism, by the hard left. There are aspects of the system where they're right, they really aren't fair or they aren't optimal. And there's a real challenge both to differentiate them, to have a kind of an intelligent critique of current financial system without throwing it out and going into Venezuela. And
Right.
moreover,
Right.
of making those distinctions widely enough appreciated that people won't just come after Wall Street with pitchforks, but will support the kinds of reforms that really will make the system fairer and more stable.
And there does seem to be social pressure on billionaires to give away most of their wealth. There seems to be more and more people, kind of like Zuckerberg, the latest. No, not Zuckerberg. Amazon. Bezos.
Bezos,
Jeff
yeah.
Bezos, just he and his wife offering. They just gave $2 billion. So maybe that's another way to kind of move the needle in that direction, privately at least. All right, I've been told we got to move to the lightning round here before we go to Q&A. A couple more things that I've been thinking a lot about. Campus craziness, safe spaces, microaggressions, you know the routine. We've all know about Middlebury and Evergreen and Yale and the Halloween costumes and and so forth. So I just had Jonathan Haidt on my Science Salon podcast and said, I'm not 100% sure I'm on board with your thesis in the book. Love the book. Everything you said in it is true about everything that's happened. But when I go to Chapman University, where I teach, I never see anything going on. It's just students walking around doing their thing. You're at Harvard. I mean, if I went to Harvard tomorrow, would there be protests and riots? And, probably not. Probably just. So I'm not 100% clear that this is really a crisis, or is it just something that's kind of moving in the direction of like we should pay attention to this and try to nip it in the bud, but let's not get apocalyptic about it.
Yeah, I tend to think it is a problem. I don't know if it's a crisis, but I think it is a problem that a certain range of ideas really are virtually impossible to discuss within the American university system. That certain issues about sexual assault, on race, on crime, they're just certain hypotheses that where you just don't go there. And I think it is distorting the debate. It's also with these excesses, such as the woman shrieking about the Halloween costumes and cursing a professor because his wife dared to say that students should figure out which Halloween costumes they should wear on their own without the university imposing regulations. What it does is it saps the credibility of the academy across the board. And this is red meat for Fox News and the extreme right, and even the not so extreme American right. I'm sure that you've had kind of conversations that I've had, sometimes had with thoughtful, intelligent people on the political right who say things like, well, given that the university is no longer a disinterested forum,
Right.
but there are certain orthodoxies, there is absolute repression, people losing their jobs, getting physically assaulted based on what they say. Why should we take anything seriously coming out of a university? Why should you tell me that the vast majority of climate scientists believe that human activity is warming the planet possibly catastrophically? Well, I'm willing to accept that 98% of scientists believe that, but they're all in a university where craziness prevails.
Right.
So I think we have the obligation to secure the credibility of the academy. Now this, in fact, as we know, this happens not to be true among climate scientists. They're really not overcome with political correctness. They really are doing the science. But the reputation of the university as a whole is at stake. And there are probably some issues where we really are doing the wrong thing. As Heather McDonald points out, the depolicing following the highly publicized Ferguson police shooting probably led to a bounce in the American homicide rate, so that probably an extra 1,000 to 2,000 people were murdered in each of the last 3 years since Ferguson because of the widespread attacks on the police. Most of those, by the way, or a good percentage of those are African American. If we can't talk about whether there really is racial bias in police shootings and whether the all-out demonization of police has costs as well as benefits, people will die. Now that's a conversation that Heather McDonald, coming from a independent think tank, can say, but she probably would not be able to say that in most universities.
Yeah.
So that is a problem.
That is a problem. So viewpoint diversity seems to be the solution. I don't know if this can be done just by bringing in guest speakers that are conservatives or something like that, particularly if they get deplatformed.
Affirmative action for conservatives.
Yeah,
no,
I know. It's just...
I don't think that's that itself is the answer. Yeah.
When I was a professor at Occidental College, late 80s, early 90s, they were bringing in a lot of liberal speakers. I said, well, why don't you bring in someone like Rush Limbaugh? They looked at me like, have you lost your mind? It's like, yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan, but at least he's got something else to say on the other side. Anyway.
So I think the answer is certainly not to bring in provocateurs like Rush Limbaugh and
Milo Yiannopoulos.
Forget it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, people who are kind of trolls who deliberately stoke outrage.
Yeah.
There's a difference between them and serious scholars who have highly unorthodox views, like Heather McDonald, like Charles Murray, who could defend what they say, who are clearly not earning a living by getting people riled up, but actually are sincerely making an argument. But there also has to be, I think, a recognition simply of the fact that political orthodoxy can, as one magazine put it, make you stupid. And there are studies that show this. You give people a table of numbers, and you say this is the results of a study as to whether skin cream is effective at reducing a rash, or whether this is a study on whether gun control is effective at reducing crime. And depending on whether you're on the right or the left, you read the numbers in the skin cream study accurately. It's not the case that the left or the right is more innumerate, but when you politicize the issue, then people on the right will misread the numbers as showing that gun control doesn't affect crime even when the numbers show it does, and vice versa. So we're actually doing bad scholarship and bad science when we let ourselves become infected with a priori views as to which policies are likely to succeed or fail.
Yeah.
So the idea that we have that this is simply to do, that there's a systematic source of error, inaccuracy, fallacy, if we accepted orthodoxy on the left or the right, has to be part of the common knowledge of being a thinker, an analyst, an intellectual, an informed citizen.
Let's finish with just leaving everybody with an actionable idea. What can we do? And I'll approach it from two aspects, personal and then sort of socially or politically, about changing people's minds. This is, how do you talk someone out of a crazy belief? And so, I mentioned to you, I got this correspondence with this woman who's got a couple of young kids. They own their own, her and her husband own their own business. He injured his back and then got involved with some opioid painkiller stuff and all that. Anyway, none of that's quite the... He got involved with a UFO cult type group that believes that the Pleiadians are here and they're aiding the government, which could explain the current administration.
Maybe he's right.
Yeah. Maybe he's right. The Pleiadians, they're crazy. So she's at her wit's end. I don't want to leave the guy. I love him. My kids are young and we have business. How do I talk him out of believing that, the aliens are here, and a whole bunch of other things, multidimensional beings and channelers and crystals, the whole package. Which is, kind of what I do as my, day job at Skeptic, but it really touches on the whole debiasing literature you summarize in Enlightenment Now. You're at a cocktail party talking to a climate denier or a creationist or an anti-GMO person or whatever. What do you say other than, here are the facts, you should just believe the facts? This isn't going to work for this woman and talking to her husband. He said, you just don't know what I know.
Yeah. No, it is I think, an unsolved problem. And I mean, Michael wrote a book called Why People Believe Weird Things. And that was before the events of the last few years. That was what, 1990?
97.
1997.
Yeah. And they're still weird.
And they're new weird things. I mean, they're the chemtrail people. You know when you see jets with those contrails behind them in the sky, did you know what those really are? That is the government gassing us all into submission.
That's right.
And there are people who are serious about this. But we are living in an odd time of, I don't know if I don't think that we're becoming more irrational. But, and of course, you have many examples of madness of crowds in the past, but there may be more kind of rationality inequality. That at the top end, we have things like PolitiFact, fact-checking of politicians' statements as a routine mandatory part of journalism, which didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. And the people who run it say that there is a massive demand for fact-checking, which did not exist. And this was even before Donald Trump was elected, that there's a change in what consumers of journalism expect and what journalists feel that they ought to do. You've got things like Snopes.com, which refutes urban legends. You've got Skeptic magazine, and I assume the magazine has been doing quite well. You've got Wikipedia. I mean, this crazy idea of having an encyclopedia curated by volunteers with no one in charge. And there are very few conspiracy theories or Holocaust denial or crazy stuff on Wikipedia. So at one end, you've got these enormous resources for rationality. Then at the other end, you've got the chemtrails and the Pizzagate and the Alex Jones and so on.
Right.
Now it may be, we know that simply for someone who's in the grips of one of these beliefs, simply trying to persuade them with the facts and reason tends not to work. There are people who are kind of in the fringes, in the gray area, where facts may persuade them. There are also maybe other ways that if you get a spokesperson for a cause who is of the opposite ideological camp, you find someone on the right who says, well, maybe there is human-made climate change. That is more likely to persuade people who deny it than throwing more facts at them. Because when you throw facts at them, then you just get into kind of litigation where someone who is passionate about a particular position can always muster through clever spin doctoring and litigating, can always create a persuasive case if they are well enough versed in the arts of persuasion.
Yeah.
There may also be, and I know we should be turning it over to audience Q&A, it may also be that when there's a new medium that allows information to proliferate, now it's social media, but a few hundred years ago it was the printing press. In between it was the mass-produced newspaper. There's often a Wild West period in which all kinds of crazy ideas get spread. It did happen with the rise of the printing press. A lot of people claimed that they had long-lost books of the Bible that were total fabrications. There was rampant plagiarism and Protocols of the Elders of Zion just 100 years ago, promulgated by the Tsarist secret police that many people to this day believe, but they certainly believed it in the past. And that it takes a while for this new arena of discourse to arrive at norms and institutions that prevent the crazies from taking it over and that kind of steer it in the direction of vetted proof and argument and fact-checking.
Along the lines of decoupling the claim from political or religious affiliations, like you mentioned, climate change being affiliated with Al Gore was, bad for...
It was a disaster for the awareness of climate change.
You lost half the country right there.
He made it a left-wing cause.
Right,
yeah.
So at this debate I did in the church, I could tell in the Q&A that there were still a lot of young Earth creationists, and they weren't buying evolution. They were giving me the second law of thermodynamics and the eye and all that. So I said, have you heard of the Human Genome Project and the National Institutes of Health? They're headed by this guy who completely accepts evolution, and he's a born-again evangelical Christian. He loves Jesus just like you.
Yeah.
And I said, read his
Collins.
book. Yeah.
Francis Collins.
Francis Collins. So it's like he's on your team. Don't believe me because I'm an atheist, but believe this guy. And so they're trying to find common cause at least through someone on your team, because it's so hard to get past the team idea.
Yeah, so that is a provably effective tactic.
And also, don't tell people they're idiots. You know, you're a moron to believe that. You know, the conversation's pretty much over. No ad Hitlerium. The moment you call somebody Hitler, it's over. You know, and try to understand. You know, I can understand why you hold that position, and try to articulate it. I do that, you know, because I say, well, I was kind of a climate skeptic in the '90s. I wasn't sure, you know, so I totally see where you're coming from. Oh, what changed your mind? Well, I read some literature and I did this and that. Oh, and then they look at me like, oh, could this happen to me? It's like, yeah. Well, we've been going an hour. Thank you so much for listening to us have a conversation here. We really appreciate that. And thank you. Thank you so much. So Travis, if you want to set up the Q&A, we'll rock and roll with you. I think they have microphones. Looks like there's a mic here if you want to start lining up, and maybe one there if you want to line up. These are the hard questions over here, and these are the easy questions over here. And in the meantime, just psychically talk amongst yourselves. What's that? Oh, yeah. And do you want to let me know when to start? Okay, we can start? Yep. Okay. Man, you go first.
You want to start with a hard question or
Yeah,
an easy
sure.
question?
Go ahead.
I have a comment and a question. My comment was to the effect of helping people out of, you know, what one would consider beliefs that are not useful. And I think a joke would be that to give them another crazy belief, because when you fall in love with another one, you might let go of the first one.
Okay.
But on a less funny tone, I think that people are taken with ideas because they make them feel useful, they give them something to do, and it makes them think that they're doing something which helps others. So I think that if you go to the psychological benefits of why they hold that belief, that might be a way to help see how could they can be useful and helping others and feeling that they're competent, you know, on other ways. So if you can fill the same voids psychologically that those things give, then you might be more willing to do the other things that might not be crazy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm fond of saying no one in the history of the world has ever joined a cult. You know, they join a group that they think is good, it's going to help them personally, it's going to save the world and help the poor, whatever. And, you know, so there, at least if you think about it from that perspective, you can say, okay, let's try to figure out what the reason was that they got involved, and then 10 years later they drank the Kool-Aid. You know.
And the question,
Yeah.
I guess I have too many, I'd probably need a chair up there, but I think morality is a bit of a moving target depending on culture, time, and whatever. And yesterday I was at a gathering with friends, and a lady told me her daughter works in a company, a fashion company here that has its headquarters here in Montreal. And she was saying how the employees there are evaluated not only on their performance, for example, in sales or whatever jobs they do, but they're also evaluated, their employee evaluation, yearly evaluations are also done based on whether they take care of their health. They are given points if they are vegetarian or vegan, not using their cars, if they stop smoking and things like that. I'd like to have your impressions on that, because this is an actual incorporation and it's not considered crazy by the people doing it. Thank you.
Well, I think there's several things going on there. There certainly is. We're seeing a bit of a shift where the ability of corporations to police themselves based on widespread moral norms is increasing. Sometimes called the movement of conscientious capitalism, where companies are trying to move away from the model that their only responsibility is to maximize shareholder value, which is kind of a psychopathic vision of what a company ought to be doing. And of course, there are many owners of companies who have always disavowed that very narrow mission. Of course, there also is a self-interested reason why companies might want their employees to be healthier, both so that they show up and, well, more so in the American system where a lot of health insurance is underwritten by companies. They have an interest in keeping their employees healthy. And there could be a line where at some point it becomes kind of paternalism, where you really don't want your company telling you what you should eat and what you should smoke, and the Japanese model in which all the employees show up for calisthenics every morning and in identical jumpsuits may be going too far in terms of corporations.
It sounds like a good thing, but I don't see when it enters into the evaluations.
Yep.
Yes, that seems, yeah.
All right, we got to move
Thank
on.
you very
We
much.
got to go back and forth. Just quick questions. Here we go.
Hi. At the risk of posing an unanswerable question, this has something to do with the topic you touched at the end. It seems that in talking about specific problems like identity politics and stuff, cloud people's thinking, obviously something you touched on during the talk, what could we do to encourage kind of core intellectual healthy habits, stuff like being really receptive to good arguments, considering people's viewpoints fairly? It seems like that would be a kind of a bedrock fix that would kind of bleed out into other domains of thought, and sort of tackling specific problems would be a lot easier if everyone kind of had a core of intellectual good habits. Is this just an intractable problem that certain people, for whatever reason, cannot reason correctly? Because saying the kind of things that you're saying in front of a crowd, if you were to run for public office, it would be terrible. It would be, it would be a lost cause. Obviously, there's certain factual information and reasoning that's, for whatever reason, radioactive, and it needn't be. So, perhaps this is just a brute fact, but what do you see that we could help to get us move past that?
Yeah, there's one question about how do we try to get certain norms to proliferate in discourse among educated people. And I think just identifying, at least a start would be to identify the idea that ideological conformity, that a monoculture of ideas, repression of criticism are all intellectually toxic, and that they lead us into a fallacy. And we shouldn't be so fatalistic about the possibility of being unable to improve the quality of discourse that we just sort of match demagoguery with demagoguery and say people are irrational, there's nothing we can do about it. There are many ways in which society has become more, or people as a whole become more rational. We know that IQ scores have been increasing. This is known as the Flynn effect. People actually are better at abstract reasoning. They have concepts like the statistical average, like a trade-off, like a win-win situation that were unknown decades ago. If you go back to, and again, I don't know how many of you covered in why people believe weird things, but if you go back to even congressional testimony 100 years ago, you have arguments that are truly idiotic even by today's standards. So you could have, say, a senator saying that we should restrict immigration because God gave Africa to the black people and Asia to the yellow people and Europe to the white people. And true, he gave the Americas to the red people, but we stole it from them fair and square. And that's why, that's why we should have no Chinese immigrating to the United States. Now, even by today's standards, that's pretty dumb. So and there are many ways, people don't believe in unicorns, and people will bring their kids to a doctor rather than an exorcist. So it's not that it can't be done at all. Now, in the political arena, the challenges are somewhat different. A politician has to appeal to the largest possible coalition. There are many ways for a politician to commit a gaffe, which of course is defined as when a politician says something that's true. And there is an art of messaging, and there is also an art of being optimistic without being complacent. And we know that it's possible because there have been successful politicians both on the left and the right who've done it. Barack Obama, who had the hope and change, and who had a line that I cribbed for as an epigraph for one of the chapters of my book. If you had to pick a time to be alive and you didn't know whether you'd be, what country you'd be born in, or whether you'd be black or white, man or woman, you'd choose now. Ronald Reagan on the other side was famously optimistic. So it's having countering the fatalism, the pessimism, the tribalism is not hopeless. And there may be, we know that there are specific techniques of shaking people out of their cognitive biases, and we also know that various norms and ideas can proliferate. And it's got to start with universities and journalists and people whose ideas get a wide audience.
Yeah, the idea of a liberal arts education, that's what's behind it, and more people get that now than before. I'm super encouraged of the new media and the numbers that podcasters are putting up for long-form conversations like what we just did here, or Joe Rogan talking to Elon Musk for 2.5 hours. I mean, that, to me, the fact that there, 10 million people watch this, there's a hunger for real depth of thought amongst many, many millions of people. So this whole TV idea, I talked to a lot of television producers pitching shows and stuff, and they all still think the average American viewer is an idiot and they have attention span of 30 seconds. Don't tell them what we really know. Just give them these little sound bites. No, I don't think that's right.
Thank you.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for your company this evening. My question is in regards to whether or not you were witness to Mr. Jordan Peterson's and Mr. Sam Harris's recent debates in Vancouver, Dublin, as well as London, and the quality of their debates regarding trying to find middle ground between religion and pure atheists.
Oh boy. Well, I think that's yet another example of what I just said. There's a hunger for that. We have the next issue of Skeptic that comes out next week in bookstores, and then we'll post the articles online. It has a section on Jordan Peterson. Really, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon that we're interested in. So much has already been written about this specific idea or that thing he said or whatever. We're interested in, why is there such a huge following? I went to one of his live events in Thousand Oaks in Southern California a few months ago. This is not a group of right-wing young men looking to, be shitsters out there. No. People are really interested in what he has to say. Why? Well, it might touch on the appeal of storytelling, narrative, film. Why do people find that so appealing more than, say, nonfiction books? And in part because he's putting some intellectual horsepower behind the idea that stories are meaningful and important. And we would agree to that. Now, where Jordan kind of slips over into the gray area there is, where he's not super clear about if he's just talking about, it's a metaphor and I'm not claiming it's real. So, I've talked to him and, do you believe in God, Jordan? Well, this would take me 40 hours to answer. It's like, no. Ask me. The answer is no, okay? It's not even 1 second. Okay, so, it depends what you mean by the resurrection. If it's, a metaphor for suffering, no. I mean, that's fine. But was there a guy named Jesus? Was he crucified? Probably yes, probably yes. Did he rise from the dead? Okay, we're off the page of reality there once you go down that path. So there, I think he gets into trouble. But obviously, there's something else that has nothing to do with that appeals to people.
Hi. So my question is about artificial intelligence. You've been talking about Elon Musk's appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. And so I was wondering, from your respective backgrounds, what you make of artificial intelligence as it relates to progress. And also I'd like to add the idea that to make progress, for example, in medicine, with artificial intelligence, we need to become a more data-centric society. And so I'd like to know what you think of that, maybe from a moral standpoint. Or
Yeah. Well, I think the potential of artificial intelligence to improve the human condition is just spectacular. Robotics could eliminate the need for a lot of labor that no one particularly enjoys, that doesn't particularly uplift people, like picking crops, like making beds, like driving trucks. And it does pose the problem of how do we engage people whose livelihood happen to depend on them, on those particular activities. But on the other hand, society has been able to figure out what to do with people who used to be elevator operators. That's a profession that, there's a guy in department stores who'd stand all day just moving a lever back and forth so that the elevator would stop on the right floor. One can imagine at the time, concern when the automatic elevator was invented, what are we going to do with all of the elevator operators? Well, we figured out what to do with them. Even though the scale of replacement by artificial intelligence is going to be greater. Some combination of universal basic income, perhaps, or income supplements, or the creation of new work always beyond the frontier of what artificial intelligence can do. Even if it's something like tutoring people in the developing world over the internet in reading and writing. I think there's always going to be lots of work to be done on the planet that will be beyond the ability of the artificial intelligence at a given time. Another question that's been raised about artificial intelligence, including by Elon Musk, although he's never really articulated what the threat is that artificial intelligence will either take over from us the way we took over from other animals, or the way that technologically powerful civilizations oppressed less powerful civilizations. I think that's, for reasons I won't get into now, but that I explain in the book, I think that's nonsense. I think it's based on a misunderstanding of what intelligence is. There's also the fear that if we empower artificial intelligence to bring about certain goals, it will interpret these goals so literally that it will make humans collateral damage. If we give it the goal of do whatever it takes to bring about world peace. Well, if you kill every human, then the planet will be in a state of peace. I also think that it's kind of nonsense to worry about that. Here I would, again, disagree strongly with Elon Musk, as much as I admire him for many of his accomplishments. And in Enlightenment Now, I explain the reasons.
One of my favorite lines from your book is you describe the creatures that are intelligent, that don't want to take over the world and conquer everything.
Yes, we have a name for a form of advanced intelligence that doesn't have a ruthless drive to dominate. They're called women.
Dr. Shermer, welcome to Montreal. Dr. Pinker, welcome home.
Thank you.
I actually want to appeal to both your expertise and your sensibility. I was a linguistics undergrad, and as such, I'm particularly sensitive to language dynamics, as has been inculcated in us. We live in a province that is tumultuous in terms of our language dynamics, and we're observing more. Pronoun accommodation, censorship. I characterize this all as a form of linguistic imperialism. In sociolinguistics, we are made to understand that language changes organically and on its own without prompt. However, we have Jordan Peterson making the case that they should be preserved as the plural. I'd like to know when we can distinguish between organic language change and linguistic imperialism.
Yeah, it's there isn't a bright line. There have been reforms in language pushed for political reasons that have turned out in the long run to be pretty innocuous. The fact that we don't talk about a chairman anymore. We don't refer to the human species as man, which was very common through the 1960s. And by today's sensibilities, when you read about, well, man is an intelligent animal, and it does kind of grate today, and the language has not, and discourse has not suffered from the fact that we now talk about humanity, that we use often he or she, we talk about a letter carrier and a firefighter, and that turned out not to be linguistic fascism. We accommodated it okay. I think that there are points at which it can become so intrusive that it really feels like freedom is being impinged upon with minor benefit. And there, if for no other reason than avoiding the backlash against the effort to spread tolerance, I think people should be, who are trying to impose rapid linguistic change, should back off and let some of the change be organic. That there can be a middle ground in allowing the language to evolve in beneficial directions.
I'm of the same mind. You even see it in writing where the doctor did this and then they did that. Suddenly, that doesn't seem so bizarre a thing to do.
Is that
so,
acceptable
yeah.
now?
Well, there may also be a generational change that older people might bridle at certain things that become unexceptionable to younger generations. There are also certain uses of they which have been frowned upon by self-appointed guardians of the language that are actually perfectly grammatical and have been in the language for centuries. When we say everyone returned to their seats, for example, there are purists who would say everyone returned to his or her seat. It turns out that that's just on grammatical grounds that is bogus, and it's very easy to draw non-existent lines. That's a topic I discuss in great detail in The Sense of Style, my writing style manual.
You'll be signing it later.
Okay.
Have a good evening, gentlemen.
This is as Hitch would say, echoing Churchill probably. This is a problem up with which I shall not put.
I discussed that case. Yeah. Churchill, as it turns out, didn't say it.
He didn't say it. Oh, do we know?
As with many famous things attributed to Winston Churchill,
Right.
Mark Twain, and Yogi Berra.
Do we know who said it?
Yeah, we know that he did not say it.
Okay,
Yeah.
just
As
that he
Yogi
didn't
Berra may or may not have said, I didn't say most of the things I
Right.
said.
I've talked to Jordan a little bit about the pronoun thing. I mean, to his credit, he said, if a private citizen, individual friend or whatever came and said, I prefer that you call me whatever, he'd probably do it. It's the idea of the government forcing you to do it that he objected to. I kind of see that. When I was in college at Pepperdine, I had a roommate. His name was Dwayne, and he hated his name. So one day he announced, I'm changing my name to D'Artagnan. The fourth musketeer. I'm like, what? The what now? And he said, okay, I'll shorten it. So he finally shortened it to Dar. And that's his name, Dar, D''A''R''T. Okay, whatever. Fine.
There's also a distinction within language between what linguists call the open class vocabulary, the nouns and the verbs and the names and the adjectives, and the closed class vocabulary, the articles, the prepositions, the pronouns, which are closer to the grammar, which change more slowly, and it feels more like coercion when you try to change that by external fiat.
Right.
Changing mailman to letter carrier is much easier than changing either he and she to ji or ko or na.
Right.
Yes, earlier this evening it was mentioned that there are people who have deeply held beliefs, but they're unable to articulate why they believe what they do. Now, given that there is so much dreck available in the internet, do you see a place for teaching critical thinking in the curriculum in schools? And at what age would you think that children should be taught how to think for themselves rather than just repeating and regurgitating what they hear?
Yes, and early. Definitely. I mean, that's why we published Junior Skeptic Magazine for kids. Tipped into the back of Skeptic Magazine. Now we're starting to post them online just to stand alone in case you don't want all the other skeptic stuff with the kids or the teachers or classrooms or whatever. Yeah, earlier the better, for sure. And that's why we use, Daniel Loxton's my Junior Skeptic editor, and he always uses fun stuff. I mean, like Scooby-Doo is a great skeptic television show, like every episode they uncover the mystery. It turns out it's, the guy down the street in the mask or whatever. And so he does, Bigfoot and UFOs and aliens and all the, sort of classic paranormal pseudoscience type stuff. But as an avenue into, well, how do we know that that's not true? How do you know? How does science work anyway? And so then, so all of a sudden he's teaching how science works to kids without ever actually talking about really like critical thinking or the scientific method or inductive, deductive, and hypothetical, blah, blah, blah. Don't use the words, but just use the examples. So I think, that's definitely more is better. I teach my class at Chapman is Skepticism 101, how to think like a scientist.